That Commons vote will be taking place next Tuesday, and if enough Tory MPs do rebel on this matter, then the government will need Labour's support to win that vote. So the Prime Minister has his work cut out for him on this front, and at a time when the UK and the EU trade talks are resuming in the face of a looming deadline on that front. At the Public Health England labs earlier today, the Prime Minister was discussing both issues. Prime Minister, we've been hearing concerns this morning from people in England who feel lumped in with other areas under this tier system, that there's an unfair one-size-fits-all approach in big counties like Kent, Lancashire and Lincolnshire. Matt Hancock said these restrictions would be more targeted and local. Why hasn't the approach been more local?
Well, a couple of points. I know it's very frustrating for people who feel that they're in an area where, a high-tier area, when there's very little incidence in their village or their area. I totally understand why people feel so frustrated. But the difficulty is that if you did it any other way, first of all, you'd divide the country up into loads and loads of very complicated subdivisions. There's got to be some simplicity and some clarity in the way that we do this. The second problem is that, alas, our experience is that when a high incidence area is quite close to a low incidence area, unless you beat the problem in the high incidence area, the low incidence area, I'm afraid, starts to catch up. So we've got to get the virus down, and that means following the guidance. But what I would really stress to everybody is this is not the same as the very tough autumn measures, the lockdown that we've been going through. On Wednesday, we come out into a world where shops are open, where communal worship can take place, where gyms, swimming pools are open, personal services, hairdressers and so on. A lot of the economy opens up again across all three tiers. Plus, and this is very important, we have the prospect of the vaccine coming down the track, but also in the tier 3 areas we have the added prospect now of being able to use community testing to drive the virus down, everybody working together to squeeze the disease and kick COVID out. And Liverpool has been successful. It's definitely helped in Liverpool, I should say. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of what mass testing can do, but it's definitely helped in Liverpool. It can help across the country. You mentioned mass testing, but your community secretary has admitted you don't have the capacity to roll out mass testing in all tier 3 areas, despite that being a cornerstone of the new system. How long are some parts of the country going to be left languishing in tier 3? Well, actually, we've got tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of lateral flow tests coming into this country. We already have a huge stockpile. The difficulty is not the supplies at the moment. The difficulty actually is working with local government, local communities to get them doing it. Liverpool really showed the way. We're now looking at Barnsley, Doncaster, other places around the country where they want to pull together and do it. And actually, just now in this lab here at PHE in Porton Down, I've been talking to some scientists who've seeing real progress on a UK made lateral flow test, and we're not quite there yet, but in the months ahead we'll be making them in this country as well. So the supply, I don't think, is going to be the problem. The issue is going to be getting everybody mobilised to understand the potential advantages of mass community testing. Just on the tier system again, there's considerable unease, you'll know, among some people, including some of your MPs, who find themselves entering a stricter regime post-lockdown than they were before lockdown. Are your MPs and their constituents wrong to oppose this? And are you anticipating you're going to need Labour votes to get this through? Well, you know, I perfectly understand why people are frustrated and why they don't want the measures that we're obliged to recommend and to institute. The difficulty is that we're coming out of the tough autumn measures, out of the lockdown on Wednesday, with the incidence of the disease still really pretty high, and it's about 1 in 80, 1 in 85 people in this country have it. And what we all need to do is use this tough tiering, which is, as I was saying just now, it's more relaxed by a long way than the current lockdown measures, but use the tough tiering to drive the disease down, both in the tier 3 and the tier 2 areas, until the vaccine comes on stream.
Michel Barnier is on his way to London
Yes.
later today for crucial talks this weekend. You've seen the sobering assessment this week from the Office for Budget Responsibility regarding the costs of a no-deal Brexit, what it could do in terms of worsening unemployment figures and the damage to the economy. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are we to see a trade deal announced next week? And given the position the economy is in, can you afford not to get a deal?
Well, the likelihood of a deal is very much determined by our friends and partners in the EU, who, there's a deal there to be done if they want to do it, which would, I think, benefit people on both sides of the channel. But let's be absolutely clear: this country can prosper and will prosper mightily in either event. And if we have to come out with a so-called Australian style model, an Australian relationship with the EU, we will make a great success of it.
And what's your instinct? How likely is a deal?
I'm not going to comment on that. Where everybody's working very hard, but clearly there are substantial and important differences still to be bridged. But we're getting on with it.
Andy, a lot of focus there on England and the tier system in your interview with the Prime Minister. What about the news from Wales today?
Well, we got a warning from the Welsh Government today that the ground gained during the firebreak in Wales, which ended 2.5 weeks ago, was being eroded, that there was an alarming rise in cases, particularly among the under-25s. And I mentioned a while ago the R rate across the UK believed to be below 1 now. Well, that was the case in Wales during the firebreak and in the weeks after. But now, ominously, the First Minister has said the latest calculations suggest that it may be as high as 1.4 in Wales. Hence the need, he said, for further measures.
We too, now here in Wales, need to use the coming weeks to reduce the spread of the virus and to create more headroom for the Christmas period. That doesn't mean a return to firebreak arrangements, but the Cabinet has agreed to take further specific and targeted action to reinforce the current national measures we have in place.
In terms of that action, he went on to say that pubs, restaurants and bars in Wales will face further restrictions from next Friday, but rather unnervingly for the sector, he didn't give any details on that. They'll be worked out over the weekend and an announcement made on Monday. Shops, hairdressers and gyms will remain open. These will be Wales-wide measures. They won't be done by regions, and that attracted criticism from the Welsh Conservatives today, as well as the lack of detail in today's announcement. But for the hospitality sector in Wales, there will be real trepidation this weekend, I suspect, as they wait to find out on Monday what their December destiny will be. Back to you in London.
Nicely put. Andy, thank you very much indeed. Well, Northern Ireland has just begun another 2 weeks of circuit breaker restrictions, with pubs and restaurants shut and most shops only able to operate on an appointment-only basis for collection. It follows a steep rise in the number of hospital admissions and warnings that the health service could swiftly become overwhelmed. Well, earlier I spoke to Christina Pagel, who's Professor of Operational Research at the University College London and a member of the independent SAGE Group, and Andrew Rossendale, who's Conservative MP for Romford. Andrew Rossendale, Christina Pagel, thanks very much for coming on the programme. Let me start with you, Andrew Rossendale, if I may. So we hear just now that the R number is at 1 or just below 1. And yet Romford, like the rest of London, your constituency, is in Tier 2. Do you think that is unfair?
I think the whole thing is unfair. I understand why the government are doing it, but I think the mood of the country has changed. I think we need to get Britain moving and get Britain back to work. I think that too many livelihoods and jobs are going to be lost out of this. I understand why it has to be done, but I think when we look back, I fear it's going to be seen as a huge overreaction.
Christina Pagel, a huge overreaction. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I disagree. Back in mid-September, we were averaging about 20 deaths a day from COVID. Now it's over 400. And there's no reason to think that without lockdown, that wouldn't have carried on going up. The OECD released data today. There was an article showing that the countries that had the least impact on their economies are the ones that had the lowest death rates and had suppressed COVID the best. So it's not the case that it's the economy or health. It's both. If you suppress the virus, you can have an open economy.
Christina, you can see why people think that it's fundamentally unjust if they live in a village or a town or a city that has seen very low infection rates, and yet they're lumped together, with the rest of Kent or the rest of whichever areas in Tier 3, for instance, and they've seen their economic and social life virtually shut down.
I mean, there are very few places that have very low infection rates. I mean, remember that in the summer, the government imposed quarantine from external countries at rates of 20 cases per 100,000 people. There is nowhere in England that is that low. And the key isn't just how many cases you have now, it's what the growth rate is. So back in October, everyone was saying, the Southwest is really low and it's fine, but it was going up and their hospitalizations went up a lot. And they've only just started coming down about a week after lockdown. So it's not as if it's just fine just because currently there aren't that many cases. You have to think about how COVID spreads, and it spreads with contact.
But a lot of it is also down to explanation, isn't it? Especially if we say, as the government keeps saying, that they're following the science. So, what people want to know, and they haven't really had an answer to yet, is why, for instance, is it more dangerous to go to a restaurant where you sit apart from each other than to go to a gym?
What's dangerous about going to a restaurant is the fact that you're not wearing a mask, you're talking, and often you're laughing. And those kind of situations are just where it seems to spread easiest. I mean, it's that kind of socializing. We saw in Canada, they had Thanksgiving at the beginning of October. 3 weeks later, they have massive spikes and are now having various lockdowns across their cities because of it. And we're facing something, very similar with Christmas.
The problem is the argument, the logic of this argument is that we keep locking down and we go on locking down. And there's no one saying, hang on, what is the effects of the lockdown long term? Is that going to be devastating as well, or even worse than the effects of the virus? This is what nobody's telling us. And my instinct, and I talk to my constituents, I can tell you, most people now feel that this has gone a bit too far, that actually we should be handling this differently. The idea we're going to stop anybody dying, of course, people will die. There's always people dying of pneumonia and flu at this time of year. And it does seem to me that all the figures are being muddled up and inaccurately recorded as well.
So if you were in charge now, if you were Prime Minister, what would you be doing?
I would be protecting the vulnerable very strongly in every possible way we can do, but allowing everybody else to go back to work, to open up their shops and businesses, to keep the economy, get the economy back on its feet.
OK, Christina Pagel, if Andrew Rossendale was Prime Minister and what he just described to us would become policy, what would happen to infection rates and death rates in this country?
Well, I mean, there wasn't any policy. It was just we need balance. But how do you have balance when you have a virus that spreads every chance it can get? What we needed to do is have a really good test and trace system, have really good messaging, have support for people isolating. We haven't managed to do that. It still hasn't got any better. And so we're forced into these kind of lockdowns. It's a terrible thing to do. But if you just let COVID run free, then if hospitals get full, they can't treat any type of condition. It's not just COVID people who suffer, everyone suffers. People aren't willing to go out. People do not spend. Consumer spending in the OECD dropped in the countries that had the most COVID. It's not the case that somehow if you let people go, they'll go out and spend if there's COVID rampant. Who wants to go shopping if they think they're going to get sick?
Andrew Rossendale, do you think that if we had locked down earlier, when we should have done back in March, we wouldn't be faced by this dilemma right now?
Look, there's lots of what-ifs. Potentially we should have locked down earlier in March. There's lots of things that, in hindsight, we can look back and think, if only we had done that. There is no one straightforward answer to all these different questions. I am thinking, and I say it again, I am now thinking of the effects on the British people long term. In the new year, Boris needs to rethink this. Be bold, face this down, protect the vulnerable, but let's get Britain working again.
I mean, you can't just, none of it really makes sense. You can't just protect the vulnerable. The effects of COVID are really bad. The effects of lockdown are really bad. But if you let COVID go, it doesn't protect the economy. That doesn't help the economy. And with a vaccine around the corner, I mean, this is our chance to really get into the situation where we can protect everybody and not let people die in the meantime. I just can't imagine anything worse than being one of the third wave to get COVID when we know that there are vaccines that are coming in a couple of months. I mean, this is the time to say, actually, you know what, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Let's just get there with as minimal illness and sickness and death as we can. If we have, you know, good support for businesses, good support for people who are really struggling, then we can come out of this in a position to open up the economy and make it thrive again.
OK, got to leave it there. Christina Pagel, Andrew Rossendale, thank you both of you.